All right, what's up, everybody? I'm back. I'm back with my friend Jesse Zurawell, here to talk more about what's going on in Israel, Palestine, in Gaza, the violence that's happening there. It's a really important topic that we can't just talk about in one video or two videos, and it's really significant what's going on. This third Intifada, right, Jesse? So, Jesse, I'm glad to be joined by you. Why don't you go ahead and say what's up to everybody and why this issue is so important to you and how long it's been important for you?
Around my last year of college as an undergrad, so that would be 2006, I one day realized that I didn't know much of anything about what Israel had been doing, what Israel has been doing to Palestinians for, you can start the clock in 1948, but it started well before that with the invention of Zionism in the late 19th century. I didn't know much about any of that, and I didn't understand the context of occupation and the history of occupation. And for some reason, that particular lack of knowledge bothered me. And so I started to look into it more and very quickly realized the injustice that is part and parcel of Israel's occupation of Palestine. And I decided I needed to know more. So I watched a lot of interviews, and I'm by no means an expert, but that also led to concern about other happenings in the Middle East, the war on Iraq, the later on what has been happening in Yemen, what's been happening in Syria. And I think the Middle East is especially important because it's America's playground in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's imperial playground. Just like there's this book about Latin America called Empire's Workshop about how the US used and is still using Latin America and South America as a workshop of sorts to test out its imperial motives, its imperial designs. And I think that's what we see happening in the Middle East for sure. And it's mostly done by the hands of the United States and Israel. It's their playground, it's their regime change playground. And so I came to a lot of that knowledge over a long time, up until now. And there's still so much I don't know and still so much I'm learning. But it's important in general what's happening to the Palestinians, the genocide against the Palestinians, because it is one of the, if not the last colonial wars in the world. And it's a genocide. It's
Mm-hmm.
something that we should not sit back and say, well, that's what happens. That's the way the world works. And they've always been doing it. And it's an ethno-religious conflict, which it's not. And it's easy to push it out and wipe your hands of it or not even pay attention to it at all. And in my case, I wasn't paying attention to it for a long time. And once I got into the nitty gritty of it, I couldn't ignore it anymore. So that's where I'm coming from. But what's happening now, even though it's nothing new, it's still horrendous. And it is new in the sense that it's more flagrant than it's ever been. Israel's pretty much coming out and saying, fuck you to the world, and we're going to do what we want to do to the Palestinians so that we can conquer more of their territory and eventually erase them completely.
It's like undeniable at this point the atrocities that Israel's doing. Like we see them burning stuff outside of the Al Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site for Islam, during Ramadan. It's absolutely disgusting, and I'm proud. I told my audience earlier when I had Robert Inlakesh on. I said I'm proud that a lot of you guys are calling out the bullshitters out there that are still two siding this thing. Like we see people that are used as like a mascot by all these NGOs like the Sunrise Movement. We saw like Greta Thunberg trying to two sides this thing. We see celebrities that are saying, "Oh, my heart is broken for what's happening to Israel," and they bring up Hamas, 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 Hamas. They don't think
Right.
about how we got here. How did we get here? We
Right.
got here because this is imperialism. This is like you said, like colonialism still happening to this day. I want to give a shout out to the chat here. Dina said, "Thank you both for not shutting up about this." Yeah, we're not going to shut up about this. We're going to keep talking about this as the weeks go by. This is not going to go away. This is the third Antifada that's happening here. Anthony Reyes, what's up? Fetish Magic, Shadow Band Refugee, what's up, fam? Clint Eastwood, Ricky Rants, our buddy Jesse is in the chat.
Oh, hey, Ricky.
Yeah, so we were talking before the stream about how there's like it's we expect a lot of these responses from these neocons and Republicans to be supporting Israel. A lot of people who are sponsored by AIPAC. But we see a lot of progressives that are taking an opportunity up. They're taking advantage of the moment, right? AOC,
Yeah.
which I'm gonna pull up a tweet. She's calling out Andrew Yang just because everybody was calling out Andrew Yang. All these Bernie supporters, former Bernie supporters, or people who still support Bernie for some reason. I don't know why they still support Bernie, calling out Andrew Yang.
Yeah, I think
But she's
they've all been I think they've all been lobotomized.
yeah, and then she doesn't call out Nancy Pelosi, who
Hmm.
is very, very, very much a supporter of Israel. She's not calling out Joe Biden, who she was telling people to vote for, who's in like I mean he's our president right now. How are you not calling out Joe Biden first ahead of Andrew Yang?
Hmm.
Right? So
I,
what are your
I
thoughts on that, man?
I think what Andrew Yang said is despicable, and Glenn Greenwald, shortly after that whole hubbub came to the fore, Glenn Greenwald put out a piece saying that what Andrew Yang tweeted was meaningless. And I absolutely disagree with that. I think that all it does in calling it meaningless is it perpetuates this progressive patina of care, of solidarity with Palestinians. And it's completely false. It's used by these progressives when it's convenient. And I don't know what Andrew Yang's motives are, if he's trying to get back in the political game, get back to any kind of substantive relevance in the world. But it's not meaningless because, as I said, it continues not only the patina of progressives who claim to support, claim to stand in solidarity with Palestine, but it also, there's the Yang Gang, and it also
Mm-hmm.
this guy has followers. This guy has a cult of personality behind him, and that is a statement like that is going to reinforce the idea to his followers that we should stand with Israel, even though it's committing genocide against Palestinians. And then there's the other aspect of politicians like AOC, like Rashida Tlaib, like Ilhan Omar, putting out these tweets that are really milquetoast statements of solidarity with Palestinians, but they're well within the parameters of polite discourse, so they don't offend Israel and they don't put their careers at risk, but they can
Yeah.
still placate their base, if you will, and say, well, look, I said something. I'm standing up for Palestinians, even though a tweet which essentially says nothing at all means nothing as far as Palestinian solidarity goes.
Or they're the tweet squad. That's what they do. All they do is virtue signal on Twitter.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, it's like you said, they're trying to be safe. Like they don't want to look bad for some of the Israeli supporters out there that they could garner. But I wouldn't give a fuck. Like during South Africa's apartheid state, like you would be looked at as a hero in history if you said fuck South Africa, right? So if they want to look good in history, then say fuck Israel, right?
right.
Because because they're abusive right now. They look like, we see the documentaries that Abby Martin put out, that Robert Inlakesh puts out. Like, there are children that are starving, that are being killed. Like, these soldiers don't care. It's absolutely abusive. It's racist. And now we have a president who calls himself a Zionist. So I'm gonna play this clip for everybody. Guys, this is who we were being guilt tripped by people like TYT, by the Humanist Report, by a bunch of other people telling us to vote for Joe Biden. Otherwise, we're voting for fascism. Well, guess what? You got fascism anyway under Joe Biden. So I'm gonna adjust the audio so you can hear this clip also, Jesse. Yeah, bear with me, guys. I'm just adjusting the audio here, since I'm working with cheap tech. Here we go. Yeah, listen to this, Jesse. Here's Joe Biden in 1986. Here's what he said.
We look at the Middle East. I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
Jesus Christ. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel. So Emo Bot goes on to say, it's actually pretty wild how he's straight up openly admitting that U.S. support for Israel is transactional. And if there were no Israel to do the U.S.'s bidding in the Middle East, they'd just coup some country to invent such an ally, transparently imperialistic. And then this was in Biden's website here. And Andrea Polite shares this image here. All right, that's too big. You guys can't see that. So let me zoom out here. Says in his website, like, we should have been calling him out. A lot of people are like, oh, look at his website. You can tell he's more progressive than Donald Trump. Look at this shit right here. Firmly reject the BDS movement, which singles out Israel, home to millions of Jews, and too often veers into anti-Semitism while letting Palestinians off the hook for their choice. And one final clip here. This was Joe Biden in 2020 when he gave a speech at AIPAC.
Were I a Jew, I would be a Zionist. And my father pointed out to me, I did not need to be a Jew to be a Zionist. For I am. Israel is essential to the security of Jews worldwide. Right.
Jesse, do you see this energy from Biden when he talks about healthcare or anything? Like, but then when it comes to like Israel, you see this energy like, we will create an Israel, or he's like what do you say here? You don't need to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
Right.
Like, this is monstrous.
And I don't know if he realizes in what he's saying because his brain rot was already setting in at that point, but he negates himself in both statements. Israel was invented, and the US, the UN, the UK, they played a part in inventing Israel. And also his statement that I'm a Zionist, but I'm not a Jew. He's saying right there that Zionism and Judaism are not the same thing, which is true. But I don't think he can put two and two together. He certainly can't nowadays. And both of those statements they defeat themselves. And you can hear in his voice even that he's doing this to pander to AIPAC, to pander to this extensive Israel lobby that really does control US politics, and which is why we're seeing all these tepid statements from both progressive politicians and then aggressive statements from people like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio about standing in solidarity with Israel. people who are trying to destroy Venezuela as we speak, just really terrible regime change fanatics. And Biden is among them. And the frightening thing now is that he's president, but also that he has people behind the scenes pulling the strings for him who are just as much Zionists as he is, if not more. And so it's, I think, because of the careerism that he has so ingrained in him after all the decades he's been kicking around in Congress and not doing much of anything at all, he knows how to play the game, and he's not going to step over the line and criticize Israel. But he's perfectly willing to step over the line when it comes to healthcare, as you mentioned. And before he was even elected president, he said, if a Medicare for all bill comes across my desk, I am going to veto it. He doesn't care about healthcare. He doesn't care about the welfare of the American people. And so he certainly doesn't care about Palestinian lives.
It's all about capital for him. Like this is what you get with capitalism. It's more imperialism. And then he's saying that BDS will lead to anti-Semitism. So you want to get into that and why that's a bunch of bullshit?
Well, BDS is a movement that was started by Palestinians, by Palestinian civil society, a nonviolent movement which stands for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And so that means boycotting goods that are, for me, both made in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. But I consider all of Israel, I consider all of occupied Palestine and Israel, I consider that Palestine. But boycotting goods that are manufactured not just in Israel, but also in the West Bank, where a lot of companies are located. Unilever is a huge company. I don't know if they're still located there, but they were for a while. And there are a lot of other American and Western countries who are perfectly happy to set up shop in occupied Palestinian territory and sell their wares from there. And what that does is not only provide capital to Israel, but it provides it provides a system of slave labor in a sense, because they then recruit Palestinians to do this work, to work for these companies, especially construction companies, for example, the building of the apartheid wall. Palestinians have been hired to help build an apartheid wall that is meant to keep them contained, to ghettoize them. And I don't see how it's anti-Semitic to not want to refuse to buy products that are produced in a climate like that. And only further, an illegal occupation. I don't know if there's such thing as a legal occupation, but Israel's occupation of the West Bank in particular. And look, the argument's simple. Are you going to support an occupation and businesses in that occupation that provide capital for that occupation to continue and provide capital for the country that's carrying out the occupation, which is genocidal in nature? Or are you going to take a step back and say, I don't want to put my money toward that? We're already having our tax dollars siphoned off to the tune of $4 billion a year to Israel, so they can have free healthcare and universal education. And I'm supposed to sit here and be told that it's anti-Semitic, that it's a crime against Judaism because I want Palestinians to have human rights and self-determination, and I'm choosing this path of nonviolent resistance. They're only calling it anti-Semitic because they're afraid of it, and because they know it's effective, and because they know it's gaining traction. And it, along with the one-state solution, is the only game in town now. There's not going to be Gaza, and then Israel in the middle, and then the West Bank, and then a tunnel between them, which between Gaza and the West Bank, which if you look at Jared Kushner's failed, pathetic deal of the century, there was supposed to be a tunnel between Gaza and the West Bank. Like Israel's ever going to allow a tunnel? It's like obsessed with blowing up tunnels. So to me, the it's easy. It's very easy to defeat that argument. Are you going to stand with apartheid, occupation, and genocide, and the companies that are participating in that for whatever economic incentives Israel provides them, or are you going to not participate in it? And it has nothing to do with the fact that these companies may be run or owned or employ Jewish people. It has nothing to do with Judaism. Mm-hmm. It's not about ethnicity. It's not about religion. Right. It's about the theft of land, and it's about capital, as you said.
Yeah. What do you say to people who are like, oh, this is going to hurt the Palestinians, like if we boycott the Israeli state?
Well, the Israeli state is committing genocide against the Palestinians, so I don't see how they could be hurt that much more. And on top of that, the Palestinians are the ones who are the people who have called for BDS, who have invented it, for lack of a better word. It's a Palestinian civil society movement that comes from Palestine. So it's one of the many means they have at their disposal to resist their occupation by any means necessary. And it's a nonviolent method. And Israel doesn't like that. Most American politicians don't like that. But then there's nonstop whining about Hamas rockets when these peaceful protests like BDS, like the Great March of Return, don't work, because you have Israel shutting down BDS as anti-Semitic. And then at the Great March of Return, you have these like man-children snipers shooting kids in the head. Mm-hmm. And it should be noted that when they do that, that's not just them deciding to do that. That order comes from the top. That comes from the top brass of the military. And it's been admitted, I forget the official's name, the military official's name, but he said that every time, at least during the Great March of Return, that a sniper fired at an individual, it was approved from the top. So it wasn't just willy-nilly firing. They would say, look, I have this kid. He's too close to the fence. I have this kid in my sights. And then it goes up the command, and then it comes back down and says, okay, take this kid out. And that's what we saw happen. But then Israel spins it in like some of the most grotesque ways, saying Palestinians were not being directly targeted. They were accidentally walking into bullets. I mean, for fuck's sake, it's not even within the realm of reality anymore how Israel spins what it's doing. And that points to how so genocidally out of control they are. And we can see that in the streets of Tel Aviv. We can see that in Jerusalem. And we can talk about that if you want. But really what it points to is that Israel is collapsing. It's collapsing inward on itself.
Yeah, and what Robert Inlakesh was saying when I had him on is he hasn't seen Palestine this united before. Right. They just had it, and then they share share that common enemy of Israel that's oppressing all of them, and so they've all come together to fight against this big bully.
And yeah, it is an enemy. It's not hyperbole or in bad taste to call it that. It's absolutely the truth. Israel is the enemy of Palestinians. And if you don't believe that, just look at what Israel has done since 2014 even. You don't have to go back to 1948. You don't have to go back to the late 19th century, although I recommend you do. But this is Israel's, it's de rigueur for them. You know, they call it mowing the lawn. They call it mopping up. Palestinian lives mean nothing to them.
And they have high tech gear to kill them, like high tech weaponry that's funded by the U.S. So if we're already pouring billions of dollars for Israel, which has free healthcare, we don't, but they do, and we fund that, then yeah, we should advocate for more for BDS. So it's really disgusting to see when people like Bernie or other politicians that are saying, "Oh no, BDS is not the best path forward. It's anti-Semitic." Well, would you be saying that during when South Africa had the apartheid state, because BDS worked then?
Right.
So why are you saying that now?
Right. And I don't know if in their heart of hearts they oppose it, but what I think is especially problematic about the way they've approached it is that they've framed it as a free speech issue and not a human rights issue. And it's a human rights issue. It's about the self-determination of indigenous Palestinians who've been living under this disgusting genocidal boot heel of Israel for decades now, since 1948. Even before that, if you want to go to the 1930s and talk about the Arab Revolt and people like Hassan Kanafani, there's always been resistance to Zionist settlement and then Israeli colonization by the indigenous Palestinian population. And that's what we're seeing now. But I want to go back to the point that you made about what Robert said and having not seen Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank disunited before. I think that's a good point. And I spoke with Miko Peled the other day, and he made a similar point and said that for Palestinians in Gaza, Al-Aqsa, the mosque, not the compound, the mosque is just as important as it is to Palestinians who live in the West Bank. And that's something they share. That's something they're united over. As you said, it's the third holiest site in Islam. And so when it's stormed, people in Gaza feel that just the same as Palestinians in the West Bank. And that's where the rocket fire comes from. And how can you sit back and say that Palestinians don't have a right to defend themselves after the third holiest site in their religion has been, stormed? We keep hearing this word stormed. The Capitol was stormed. Everything gets stormed, right? It wasn't stormed. It was attacked and vandalized, and pretty much these Jewish colonists, these fanatic colonists were trying to destroy it. And it goes back to it's such a big echo to of what we saw in 2000 when Ariel Sharon stormed in with 1,000-strong retinue and basically incited the second intifada, which didn't end up well for Palestinians. It never does, even though it's a legitimate form of resistance for them. So even though what we're seeing is nothing new, I think it's a good point to be made that Palestinians now do seem more united than ever before. And also that there are more people in the world who are waking up to what Israel is and its history, its untoward history, its disgusting history. And that has nothing to do with Judaism whatsoever. And people who try to conflate Zionist genocide against Palestinians as some kind of attack on Judaism are either stupid and don't know what they're talking about, or they do and they're being disingenuous.
It's self-defense, and by international law, they have a right to defend themselves from colonial conquer.
Right.
I want to give a shout out to the Convo Couch for who are in the chat right now, and they also gave a super raid. Fiorella gave a great stream earlier talking about how all these people on the left, there was a lot of people on the left that were shaming people into voting for the imperialist Joe Biden, and then what do we get? So the best way that the Palestinians can succeed in fighting off their colonial conquerors, um, their occupiers, is if they get some support from us. They're not going to get support from us if we keep voting for imperialist after imperialist after imperialist, and we keep praising a lot of these synthetic leftists like AOC, who are in it for their career. They're not in it to actually help people. If we keep praising these people and don't identify them as our enemies, as our obstacles, then that path to success for the Palestinians is going to be farther away. So we have to point that out so that they can get closer towards succeeding against their fight, against their conquerors. So yeah, Jesse, look at these tweets over here that I'm about to show you.
I just want to say that
Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with that technically, but I don't think any U.S. politician is ever going to budge
No.
when it comes to Israel.
It's just so that we can point out, look, these politicians, they're not going to do shit. Stop relying on them. Stop voting for them. Stop focusing your energy and giving money to these people, because that's not a way forward. A way forward is if we take action ourselves and put pressure on whoever's in office, put pressure on so that we can stop aiding Israel for this for this genocide.
Yeah.
But yeah, electoral politics is not the way forward.
Right. And that's why I'm a big supporter of BDS, because it lies outside of electoral politics. It terrifies electoral politics, as we've seen. And I think it's one of the few, if not the only ways forward as far as helping Palestinians achieve self-determination. And again, it's not up to us in the West to decide how Palestinians choose to resist their occupation, the genocide that's being waged against them. That's their choice. We have no right to tell them how to resist. Mm-hmm. And that includes BDS, that includes armed struggle. Mm-hmm. And the argument is as simple as that. And anybody who wants to go beyond that and say, well, Hamas is firing its Qassam rockets indiscriminately into Israel. First of all, give me a break with that. And we can talk about this if you want to, because Israel likes to place its military installations in civilian areas. And I don't buy the narrative that Hamas is just sitting back in Gaza and is like, okay, let's just fire another rocket and see where it lands. I think just as Hezbollah was firing Katyusha rockets into Israel in 2006, and they were called indiscriminate, Hamas is doing the same thing, and they're using the only weaponry they have to try to hit these targets. And yes, they do kill civilians, and I am not condoning that whatsoever, but they are resisting an insane force of genocide. It's coming from the air. It's now on the ground. Israeli troops have now entered Gaza, like we saw in 2014. And I expect that they're going to get routed just like they did in 2014. They're going to flee like the cowards they are, because they are terrible at fighting on the ground. You're talking about conscripted dentists and mechanics and engineers here. They're not soldiers. They have to fight. It's mandated by the so-called state of Israel. And so what we're going to see again, what happened in 2014, but I think probably to even a more brutal extent. And that is Israel's troops are going to get their asses handed to them in Gaza by resistance forces like the Qassam brigades. And then they're going to flee and they're going to call in more airstrikes. And we're going to see just insane bombardments that I don't even know if you can level Gaza any more than it's been leveled. The UN was saying by 2020, Gaza will be unlivable. We're in 2021 now, and Israel is still continuing to bomb Gaza. It's absurd on all levels.
And what are they supposed to do? Like turn the other cheek for how long? Until they're all dead? Because that's what it will lead to if they don't fight back.
Yeah, it's anybody who's couching it in the terms that Israel is defending itself, that Israel didn't provoke this, like it's provoked every other war with not just Palestinians, but other Arab countries as well. They keep saying Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel has the right to defend
Yeah,
itself.
and what about Palestinians? And people who
Right.
don't see what you and I are seeing, Jesse, are just not asking enough questions. They're being lazy, critical thinkers, because they're like, oh, Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Why is there Hamas? You think that there
Right.
will be a Hamas if there was a country that was occupying Palestine right now? Do you think that there
Right.
would be a Hamas? Hamas exists because of the oppression that these people are feeling.
Yeah. And in the 80s, Israel was actually encouraging the development of Hamas as an alternative to the PLO, which was essentially its mortal enemy at the time. And then Hamas gets democratically elected in 2006 in what was widely regarded internationally as a very free and fair election. The people of Gaza chose Hamas, and that's their legitimate government. And then what did we see happen after that? The blockade and siege of Gaza, which is still happening today, and is why it's this open air prison, this ghetto filled with 2 million people who are starving, who are living under constant siege. Even if Israel isn't bombing, fishermen, for example, can only go out so far in the Mediterranean. And if they go beyond a certain point, Israel claims the right to fire at them from gunships. And it doesn't even matter if it's fishermen out in sea. In 2006, we saw the slaughter of an entire family on the beach at Gaza from an Israeli gunship. No reason ever provided, probably some pattern of life justification like we see with drone strikes. So it's the point of all this is that Israel is out of control and it's collapsing in on itself. And that's what we're witnessing now. And we need to be realistic about that. And we need to stand up for Palestinians more than ever, because Israel really is trying to erase them. Ahmadinejad supposedly said in 2005, I think it was, at the UN, that one day we hope to wipe Israel off the map. Which, if you read the accurate translation of that, that's not what he said. He said one day Israel will disappear from the map, and that's what we're seeing happen now. And Israel's doing it to itself. It's not Hamas who's doing it. It's not Palestinians who are doing it. It's not Fatah who's doing it. It's not Hezbollah who's doing it. Israel is doing it to itself.
Yeah, it's like saying like a bully, like if they're bullying somebody and one day that person that they're bullying stands up and fights back, it was the bully that did that to himself or herself, right?
Right.
That they got punched by that person they were bullying because they were the ones that were bullying that person. They did it to themselves.
Right.
That's what people need to understand. It's counterproductive, and it's not conscious of Israel. There were the actions that they're taking, because in the end, it's self-destructive for them, right? It's the natural order of things.
Yeah, and I think what's important to note too is that Israel, as a Zionist state, needs to maintain a Jewish majority, to keep it a Jewish country for Jews and Jews only, and Palestinians who happen to live in Israel will remain third-class citizens. But if you live in a country that is based on Zionism, which is a racist philosophy that has little, if anything, to do with Judaism, if you live in a country like that, and that necessitates maintaining a Jewish majority through apartheid, through these genocidal bombing campaigns, then you better expect to get hit back. And I don't care if that bothers you. That's just the reality, the material reality of how human beings work. If you are brutalizing a population for decades upon decades and you get hit back, you have no right to whine or complain. And what do we see too when that happens? When just one Israeli soldier is killed, we know everything about that soldier. We get to know everything about him, his name, his family, where they live in Israel,
Trying to
occupied
humanize
Palestine.
him,
Right.
right? Yeah,
And we never hear the name of one Palestinian
yeah, because they
who's
want to
murdered by
dehumanize
Israel.
them.
In independent media, we do.
Hmm.
There are outlets who do a good job of naming these victims, but mainstream media doesn't care. And it's always couched in the terms of not Palestinian civilians, but potential militants. Like, what does that mean? We're all potential militants. If I decide I want to be a militant in 2 weeks, doesn't that make me a potential militant? And that really points to the other part of this war, this genocide, which is the language game and the control of the narrative. And Israel is beyond professional when it comes to that, and we're seeing it play out now. But I don't think it's carrying much water anymore, because it's so obvious to so many people the omissions that are being made. I mean, the New York Times is like allergic to the word occupied.
Yeah, if you do like control find, you won't find that word in their articles.
Yeah, I read a piece by Isabel Kirshner recently, who has long written about Palestine and Israel, and who has a child who actually served in the Israel Defense Force, the IDF. Mind you, this is a writer for the New York Times, and she wrote a piece recently about what's been happening in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, where 6 homes are set to be evicted, or 6 families are set to be evicted, and Israel is going to give the homes over to Jewish Israelis, and that's it. Here's your home. You who are living here, you're gone. You don't have a permit, or whatever kind of bullshit legal justification Israel wants to use. And I think that plays into what we saw happen at Al-Aqsa, and then leads to retaliatory measures by Hamas and other resistance groups, other defense groups within occupied Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that was a little rambling. I tend to go off on tangents when I talk about
This is
subject.
important stuff to hear. Like, we need to hear this stuff in detail, what's going on. There's people getting their homes taken away. Like, I remember Richard Menhurst sharing a video about somebody whose home was getting destroyed, and then the Palestinian was like, no, please don't destroy my home. You don't have to do this. And the guy who was going to live there, or they were trying to kick her out of the home, and it's like, if it's not me, then somebody else will. Which is like, he's wrong for trying to take her home away, but he was correct by saying that if it's not me, then it's going to be somebody else, because that's just the way that things are there. They're removing Palestinians from their homes and replacing the people that live in those homes with Israelis.
Yeah,
and then they're getting bulldozed and all that.
Yeah, and the New York Times, they have a Jerusalem bureau, and Max Blumenthal has been really good in pointing this out, that where that bureau is based, where those people live, is actually a house that was stolen from Palestinians and repopulated with Israelis. So you're having so-called journalists for the New York Times living in a stolen house, and we're supposed to expect them to write with any kind of
non-bias, right?
Yeah, I don't want to say objective, because I think objective journalism is a fallacy, but we're supposed to expect them to provide a real context, a substantive context. Like I said, they can't even bring themselves to use the word occupied. And in this Isabel Kirshner piece I referenced earlier, I don't know how many words it was, let's say 1,000, but I searched for how many times the word occupied or a derivative occupier came up. it only came up once in the whole article, and it was in a sentence that was something like, some claim it's occupied territory. So it's almost like her editor was said to her, well, this is just a little too Zionist. Maybe we can throw something in there that will make it seem balanced, but they're totally on the side of Israel. And you can see it in the journalism, and you can see it in journalism at so-called adversarial outlets like The Intercept. Robert Mackey recently came out with a piece, and just the headline itself is a lesson in whitewashing. And then the subheader too, or the little synopsis they put underneath the headline, it's also a lesson in whitewashing. You don't even have to read the whole piece to see that, but I do recommend reading it, because if you want to know your enemies, that's how you do it. You got to read the shitty shit, like The Intercept and the New York Times.
This makes me think about how a lot of people in the New York Times and people who are in CNN and MSNBC who are pro-Israeli are in the same talent agency as a lot of these actors and actresses that support Israel, like Gal Gadot. I don't remember which talent agency she's a part of, but I'm pretty sure she's in one of them, CAA or UTA.
And it's funny. Well, it's not funny, but every time something like this happens, when Israel wages another genocidal campaign against Palestinians, these Israeli actors and actresses pop up with their opinions, like their opinions on what's happening even matter, like they even know what's happening. But Gal Gadot seems to be one who always pops up, and I don't know why that is, because in my opinion, she's overrated. I haven't seen anything she's in that, you know, warrants any kind of
she's in a lot of big blockbuster movies,
which often suck. And the point being, whether it's Gal Gadot, whether it's Bette Midler, whether it's, I think, Rosie O'Donnell, Wolf Blitzer, he's a Zionist. He's actually come out and said that he's a Zionist. And you can go on YouTube and watch old footage of debates he had
with Finkelstein.
There's the Finkelstein one where he gets torn apart, and there are other ones too.
And then they don't have any Arab people like in mainstream media that talk about Palestine and what's going on there, or these other Arab countries. And I can't think of any Arab celebrities, like actors or actresses, that are in the spotlight that are talking about this stuff.
And then where are the people like Susan Sarandon, like Mark Ruffalo, like...
Oh, I saw Mark Ruffalo come out in support of Palestine, but who knows, he might be just doing that for opportunism. I don't know him personally.
I didn't see that he came out with a statement, but I don't think he's an opportunist, only because in 2014 he was coming out against what Israel was doing. So I do think that he's sincere. But why hasn't Susan Sarandon said anything? Why hasn't, I mean, forget about Greta Thunberg. I mean, who cares what she says? That's a PR scam right there, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But where are all these celebrities who come out en masse when it's, you know, some kind of vague campaign for a Green New Deal or against climate change, and they're just all up in arms about how we have no time? I mean, I agree. And I think it's something to be very concerned about. Climate change and global warming are real, and we don't have much time. But why are you all up in arms about that existential crisis, and you can't come out and say something about a genocide that's happening?
And it's related
right
because
before your eyes.
They want resources from that region, right? And then they use those resources to overexploit them and create more environmental destruction and more climate change. That's what they want from that. That's the whole reason why it's happening. And so these rich people, you know, they fund for Israel to get installed, and so that they can have control over that region. They do favors for each other, Israel and these Western powers, and then they have access to all these resources that they use so that they can make money. And as they use those resources and exploit them, then there's more environmental destruction and climate change happening.
Yeah, and as far as resources go, in the West Bank, Israel or the Jewish colonists, they have stolen all, if not all of the aquifers, the water aquifers, just about all of them. And they purposely build their colonies on hilltops so that they can look down on Palestinians, both literally and metaphorically, I suppose you could say. And they build on the aquifers so that while there will be a Palestinian village that may be encircled by the apartheid wall that has no access to clean water, up on the hill, there's a nice colony with swimming pools and clean running water, but it's for Jews and Jews only. And that's apartheid. And apartheid is part and parcel of genocide. So that's what we see happening in the West Bank. Certainly what we see happening in Gaza, even though it's not based on resources. But yeah, water is certainly one of the most valuable resources that Israel has been stealing in the West Bank for a long time now.
Yeah, and then the water that the Palestinians have is toxic.
Yeah, in Gaza, there's no drinkable water.
Mm-hmm. It's a health crisis.
Yeah,
just like what we're seeing in Yemen. I mean, it's an absolute travesty.
Right, and these wars are connected. These wars are connected through U.S. imperialism. They're connected through U.S. alliances with Wahhabi states like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, and it's because of these alliances that, U.S. support is the major thing that keeps Israel going. The U.S. could stop supporting Israel overnight and Israel would totally collapse because it relies primarily on U.S. financial support and U.S. weaponry to some extent. But Israel has also been cozying up to Saudi Arabia. We saw that especially with regard to Syria. And now the UAE has announced that it's normalizing relations with Israel. And I don't know what the end goal is for these countries doing that, but it's certainly not in the favor of Palestinians, and certainly more so for these countries to align themselves with the West, I think, as they see countries like Iran and Syria pivot toward Russia and China, and they don't really want to fuck around with the US anymore because they see what happens. Their countries get overrun by Wahhabi Contras, US sponsored Wahhabi Contras, at least in the case of Syria.
I remember when Trump wanted to take credit for all the peace deals that he was initiating with the UAE and Bahrain to normalize ties with Israel. But yeah, I mean,
whatever normalize means,
right? It's a continuation now, like with Biden, like with Antony Blinken, like all the statements that they've come out with. Like it's a continuation to the neocons that we had under Trump with Pompeo, Trump, obviously. Jesse, I want to get your thoughts on these tweets over here that
Yeah, let me just add one thing to that, if I can. We saw this under Obama too, when Obama was running for president, or when there were rumblings early on that he was going to run, and everybody was feting him as this upstart, and he might be the first Black president. At that time, he was still very much, at least on the surface, standing in solidarity with Palestinians. And maybe even before he got elected, but as soon as he got elected, that went out the window. And he made that speech in Cairo, which I think was a token gesture, because if we look at what happened after that, first of all, the war that Israel waged on Gaza in 2008, 2009. Yes, Obama wasn't president yet, but he could have come out and said something if he really was standing in solidarity with Palestinians. And he kept mum the whole time. And then he makes this speech in Cairo, which everybody, or not everybody, but a lot of people still laud as some kind of landmark action in U.S. Arab relations. And then we get the war in 2012, and then we get the war in 2014. Mm-hmm. And Obama greenlights all of this. I mean, I think the most he even tried to resist was, to tepidly say, well, Israel should stop building homes in the West Bank.
Like, hey, don't do that. That's bad. Like,
he can't even call them settlements, let alone colonies, which is what they are.
Yeah, it's not even a slap on the wrist. It's just like, hey, don't do that. It's bad. Hey,
right.
You're enabling your. It's like, well, if you do that to a child, you're enabling them to continue the bad behavior, and that's what they're doing with Israel. Is they're enabling them to continue their bad behavior. And it's funny that that Obama was so friendly to Israel. After, I'm pretty sure he knew about the people on the ground there that were saying so many racist things about him. I don't know if you've ever seen footage of that.
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Yeah, there's footage that Max took in either Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, and there's one Israeli who calls Obama a nigger. I'm not going to say the N-word because I find that I don't like censoring that way. Like, let's say the word, let's not say the N-word and then put it in people's heads, That's what the fucking asshole said. He said that word. He called Obama that. And this was maybe...
That was like 2011, was it? Or 2010?
Yeah, it was a long time ago. And that sentiment has been building in Israel since then. And if you read Max's book, Goliath, he really gets into that. He really gets into that buildup of this like reactionary, right-wing, fanatic, colonist-based culture that's overtaking Israel, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it in Sheikh Jarrah. We're seeing it in the video that came out of the Palestinian man being pulled from his car and beaten in the street on live television, on a live news feed.
Yeah.
And if we look at Hebron in the West Bank, Shuhada Street in particular, we're seeing these fanatic settlers, armed settlers, mind you. They have weapons, they have firearms. They're just terrorizing that street. They're terrorizing kids going to school. The settlers live above shops on that street, and the shops have to have sort of nets or tarps, scaffolding style over them, because the settlers like to throw down bottles of piss. They like to throw shit down. And I'm talking about literal excrement. They like to throw that down on the shops. So the shops have had to put up these barriers to that. All of which is to say that Israel has moved very, very, very far to the right. It was already very far right, but now it's so right. It's like out of the stadium on the outfield right side. It's just completely gone, and so much, or a lot of its citizenry has bought into it, and it's turned. There's really no sort of liberal or even empathetic party toward Palestinians in Israel anymore.
Which is why they're relying on armed struggle, and they're fighting back because they can't solve this peacefully via electoral politics.
Right. And point being, in general, that Israeli society is very far right. It's very racist. People are openly expressing their hatred of Palestinians and their desire to essentially erase Palestinians from existence, both currently and historically.
So check this out, Jesse. This is AOC replying to AFP news agency saying breaking Biden says Israel has a right to defend itself. And she says, blanket statements like these with little context or acknowledgement of what precipitated this cycle of violence, namely the expulsions of Palestinians and attacks on Al-Aqsa, dehumanize Palestinians and imply the U.S. will look the other way at human rights violations. It's wrong. By only stepping into Hamas's actions, which are condemnable, and refusing to acknowledge the rights of Palestinians, Biden reinforces the false idea that Palestinians instigated the cycle of violence. This is not neutral language. It takes a side, the side of occupation. Then Fiorella Isabel, she quote retweeted this and she said, number one, condemning Hamas is also both siding and manufacturing consent for Israel's acts. Hamas is a party and self-defense under apartheid is a thing. Two, why don't you publicly go after Mama Bear Pelosi, who has weight on legislation, right? Number three, stop tweeting and organize an action for pressure, right? Because that's all they do. It's mockery at this point what the squad does. Like Ilhan Omar coming out was like, can you imagine if student debt was canceled today? We need it canceled. And that's all they do. It's tweet, no action at all.
Right. Yeah. And when it comes to Israel, which I don't think many of them know much, if anything, about, AOC certainly doesn't, even though she majored in international relations at Boston University. She doesn't know anything about Palestine. And I encourage everybody to go watch the interview she did with Margaret Hoover on PBS in the summer of 2018, shortly after Ocasio-Cortez was elected. And she's asked some pretty straightforward questions about her stances on Palestine and things she said before she was elected. And she just falls to pieces under these pretty straightforward questions. And not only does she fall to pieces, she walks back a lot of what she said as far as her ostensible solidarity with Palestinians. So when she tweets stuff out like this, the only reason to pay attention to it is to give yourself a lesson in propaganda, because she's doing it because maybe she feels an obligation politically to do it, but it's not because she cares about Palestinians. Like Fiorella said, if she really cared, then she would be organizing. She would be standing up on the floor of Congress and screaming about how this needs to end, as, you know, rightfully she should. You know, all Congress people should be doing that, but it's never going to happen because, as we mentioned earlier, the Israel lobby is so deeply entrenched in American politics. And you say one thing, you know, it could be the littlest thing that criticizes Israel, and they will, if they don't ruin your life, they will try to ruin your life. And, you know, we've seen this with academics. We've seen this with students, with college students. We've seen people like Barry Weiss actually organize campaigns to call out and to persecute students who stand in solidarity with Palestine. Barry Weiss, of course, who went on to write propaganda for the New York Times, and then was she fired or did she quit? She had some kind of like
she got fired.
Queen. Yeah,
I don't pity her.
Drama queen moment where she and the New York Times parted ways, and I don't know what she's doing now. I saw her trending. I think it was yesterday, but I didn't have the stomach to click on that. But I want to segue from that into the language that's being used, because there's a language game that's being played here, and Israel has always been very masterful with that. And we're seeing we've always seen Western media pick that up, and now they're picking it up like never before. I mentioned that Isabel Kirshner article. There's another one I read. I forget the name of the journalist, or not the journalist, the stenographer. Patrick Kingsley, I want to say his name is. He could not come to write East Jerusalem, let alone occupied East Jerusalem, in his piece. It was all Jerusalem, clashes in Jerusalem, as if East Jerusalem isn't occupied and hasn't been occupied illegally since 1967. And I think we're seeing these so-called progressive politicians too, playing the language game with their tweets. They're saying, nothing that really means much of anything. It gives the patina of empathy with Palestinians while also placating Israelis, or placating Israel, but that's it. It's nothing. It really has no meaning, no substance. And I think, I don't know how long this is gonna, what's happening is going to keep happening. I do fear it's going to escalate and continue for quite a while longer, but their rhetoric's going to remain the same. They're never going to step out of line, no matter what happens, no matter how many thousands of Palestinians are killed. There's never a red line for them. And we saw that in 2014 too, with over 2,000 Palestinians killed. They barely bat an eye. When it's opportune for them to say something, they'll say something that's milquetoast, and they can't really be taken to task for it from either side. And that's what we're seeing them do now. And
I don't envy a lot of these progressive politicians that have to find wiggle rooms because they want to appease their their friends in Congress who are corporate Democrats that take AIPAC money. Who knows, maybe some of these progressive politicians do take AIPAC money indirectly. Maybe Robbie can look into it since he uncovers a lot of this stuff. But yeah, they have to find wiggle room where they have to appease the progressives, which most of them are against, their base. Most of them are against Israel's attacks on Palestinians. But then their friends in Congress, who they want to achieve political expediency with, are very supportive of Israel. So they really have to find that wiggle room, and I don't envy that at all. We were discussing earlier before the stream about how you see a lot of people in the independent left media that take advantage of this, of these moments. Like, it doesn't feel like it's sincere. So you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I'd rather not. Not that I'm afraid of any repercussions, but I don't want to go down a list of names. But there are a lot of people out there who
I think our audience is smart enough to know who's who.
Yeah. They don't need to be named, but you can see, if you look at their Twitter timelines, just their Twitter timelines, they had no concern. They had no empathy. They didn't care at all about Palestinians or what's been happening in Palestine. And now we see what's happening, and Gaza under attack is a hashtag that's been trending, which is a really good thing on Twitter. But we're seeing these self-styled independent journalists who've never batted an eye at Palestine suddenly come out and, I think, take advantage of these hashtags and this genocide that's happening so they can energize their bases and keep their whatever enterprise is going, whether they have a show or a podcast or a blog. And you're going to see, I guarantee you, in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they're not going to care anymore. They're going to get tired. They're going to get worn out. Because there's so much happening, and they're not really genuinely invested in Palestinian solidarity. And I think it's really disgusting because it sets a precedent of like false caring. And you care about something when it's in the news cycle or when it's trending, and then it's on to the next thing. And it breeds that sort of culture. So it's not really concern. It's concern only insofar as it benefits the person who's tweeting about it or making a Facebook post. And I'm not saying that that's everybody, but there are a lot of people who are doing that, and it's very obvious. If you're active on Twitter, I think you can see it. But you forget their personalities. It's about, like I said, the fact that it sets the precedent that Palestinian solidarity is a trend, and it comes and it goes. And when it comes back around again and offers some incentive to you to support, then you will. And then when it's no longer in vogue, you'll wipe your hands of it. And I think we're going to see that happening. We've seen it happen before.
They'll talk about it again when it becomes trendy again. And they're like, hey, guys, can you believe this is still happening? And then they took no action to try to alleviate what's going on, to try to mitigate the situation, to actually propose solutions on what we can do. They just... when it's trending, and then they move on to the next thing, to the point where their reporting of it is just gossip. They're just gossiping about what's going on, and they're not really proposing anything to solve the issue.
And you mentioned reporting. That's another problem too, especially Western reporting, because what do we see on CNN or MSNBC when Israel is carrying out another genocidal campaign? We see Anderson Cooper or some such personality reporting from a hilltop outside of Jerusalem, where you have Israelis sitting in lawn chairs, watching and cheering and eating hot dogs as F-15s pulverize Gaza and eradicate civilians. And CNN, the BBC, maybe other outlets, but those two for sure, I believe it's company policy that they can't say occupied territories anymore. They have to use disputed territories at most, or contested land, as if an outright theft didn't occur by Israel since 1948, and the theft is still continuing. That's part of what Israel is trying to do in the West Bank. And in Gaza, it's just, I'm not really sure what Israel's goal with Gaza is. I know that it pulled out of Gaza in 2005 because there was a demographic concern that Sharon had, because there were colonies in Gaza up until that point. Like Gush Katif was a famous one that was on the coast of Gaza. And it was, the colonists were removed and it was destroyed. But with those colonies there, technically Israel was responsible for Gaza, and the Gazan population, including those colonists, was part of the Israeli population. And that presented a demographic problem as far as trying to maintain a Jewish majority and a so-called Jewish state. So that happened. And then we've had these repeated wars on Gaza, these onslaughts, these slaughters on Gaza unleashed. And it seems like the only reason for them now is that Israel is just trying to completely eradicate Gaza. I don't know what it intends to do if it achieves that. I don't think it's going to achieve that, because Palestinians are very resilient, and their defense forces, their resistance forces are very resilient, and they're going to keep fighting. They're not going to give up. So I don't know, again, what Israel's long-term goal is with Gaza, but at least in the short term, it seems to be eradication by any means they can come up with, whether it's F-15s, whether it's sending troops in on the ground, or I don't want to say troops, they're terrorists. They send terrorists in on the ground. Um, and then they also use Gaza as a weapons testing laboratory. This is what they do. They have new weaponry. Um, Misty brought this point up in a show the other day. They test their weaponry out, and then they can sell it to American arms companies and say, look, this is battle tested. We used it against captive Palestinians. And, this white phosphorus or this flechette is battle tested, and you can now deploy it to your police departments and use it on the streets against protesters. And that's not cynical or facetious in any way. That's what happens. And also, a lot of American police are trained by IDF terrorists in containment behavior, I suppose you could say, like the knee on the neck that murdered George Floyd. The first anniversary
in Israel to Palestinians.
Yeah, and that's where it comes from. And so we're not just talking about the $4 billion we give Israel each year. We're talking about their murderous tactics coming home to us through that support. And we saw that with George Floyd, and we see that with so many other police murders.
Mike 97 brings up a great point. Says right-wing Zionists in Israel are becoming like the Nazis who genocided them and cheered. And it's also Germany that helped fund Israel. It sucks for that the Palestinians are the ones that are getting I guess the punishment that Germany, for what Germany did to Jewish people. It's sad to see.
That's a way to look at it for sure. And it's so obvious too that you're not allowed to say it. It becomes one of those observations that immediately gets ridiculed as anti-Semitic, because it's so obvious that the Jews were Nazism attempted to eradicate the Jews in the Holocaust. We know this. And now Israel, which I'm not going to conflate with Judaism because they're not the same thing, but obviously a lot of Jews live in Israel. The so-called state of Israel is, yes, now trying to eradicate Palestinians, just as Nazis were trying to eradicate them. That's an obvious fact. That's a material fact that you can't deny, but you're not allowed to say that. And people will pillory you and say, "Oh, that's such a facile comparison to make," but it's not. It's
if
true.
You know what's going on, then it's true. Then you know it's true.
And it's important to keep hammering home. And Misty has made this point in the past several times, that the hypocrisy there is just, I don't think you can compare it with anything else.
I think Israel, what they're trying to do is just create finally like a Jewish majority state, because they don't have that right now. They like to call Israel like a Jewish state, but
if you take what's considered Israel, it is a Jewish majority, and that's why there's like this. At the same time as they're genociding Palestinians, there's a containment of them in the Gaza ghetto and in the West Bank, which all chances of that being part of a contiguous and viable Palestinian state, whatever the hell that means, those are out the window. If you look at the settlement buildups, especially Area C, it's really important to look at. But you have these huge colonies like Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel. They just remove any possibility of a Palestinian state being formed, even just out of the West Bank. And this is where the name of the show comes from, facts on the ground, because that's what Israel always tries to do, especially with regard to colonizing, is create facts on the ground that are irreversible. So they can say, well, look at Ma'ale Adumim, look how built up it is. Look how many people live there. We couldn't possibly remove them and take that down. And the fact on the ground is that they live there now, and that's their land, even though it's not. And, you know, just the point with naming the show that was to play on that that notion, which is complete bullshit, and sort of reverse it to like actually talking about facts on the ground. But that's neither here or there. So yeah, I don't know where we go from here. I think it's going to escalate, as the media likes to say, and it's going to be because Israel wants to escalate it. Mm-hmm. Palestinians are defending themselves. Palestinians are occupied. Palestinians are being genocided. This is not happening to Israel. Palestinians aren't occupying Israel. They're not genociding Israel. They're not trying to push the Jews into the sea. It's Israel who's the aggressor. Mm-hmm. It's Israel who's committing the crimes. This is Israel's fault, and it needs to be taken to task for it. And there needs to be no attention paid to the IDF's tweets whining about hundreds of rockets landing in Jerusalem and other parts of Israel. You know, rockets which I don't want to say hardly kill anybody, because that sounds callous. You know, anybody getting killed is a bad thing. But when you compare the death toll, it's beyond disproportionate. So, and that's a reality that has to be acknowledged.
Also, the high tech that Israel has, thanks to the funding of the U.S. And that's what I was going to say. Like, we have to do something, because we are living in the home of the creators of Israel, the funders of Israel, the enablers. So we got to take action, guys.
Yeah. And BDS, I think, is one of the primary ways we can do that. And it's as simple as finding out which companies do business with Israel, within Israel, especially within the West Bank, and not giving them your money, not using their products or eating their food or whatever it is they produce. And
including like pharmaceuticals. Because they're in that business. Like, people got to think about that, like not just like products you get from the store, but you know, it extends really deep.
Yeah. And there's this document, I believe it's the UN document that recently came out, that takes a deep look at some of the biggest companies involved in business in the West Bank, companies who are prime targets for BDS. I can send you that document if you want to include it in the show notes. Or
yeah, that would be good.
It's a PDF, so my non-technological brain can't figure out how to
I think there's a way. I know I've seen Harlan's Media able to put up PDF somehow on their show notes.
Yeah, but it's the whole thing is worth reading, but if you go to more toward the end of it, that's where they list about 90 companies, major companies involved in business on occupied Palestinian land. And they keep doing it, they keep getting away with it, and they keep making money from it. But if we refuse to support them in any way, even if we can't achieve a complete shutdown, at least we can achieve something. It does have an effect. And that's why it frightens so many politicians, both in Israel and the United States, because it works. BDS works.
Jesse Zurawell, thank you very much for coming on, man. Thanks for bringing your insight and your knowledge about what's going on the ground in Israel. and
Yeah.
the struggle that
Thanks for having
Palestinians are
me.
having. Yeah.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
You wanna you wanna
I
let
wish I
every
could. I wish I could say this was pleasurable. What we were talking about,
Oh
but
yeah, it's hard to talk about, but it has to be discussed so people can be informed.
yeah, yeah. And kudos to you for covering it. I know a lot of other good people are too. Um, but it's always nice to interact with somebody who's on the same page and gets it and isn't just buying into the tropes and standard lines that we have to stand with Israel no matter what.
Hmm.
So thanks again for having me. Always good to talk to you.
Hell yeah, brother. Want to let everybody know where they can find you?
Sure. So Facts on the Ground is the name of a show that I do with Misty Winston. She's on Twitter at Sarcasm Stardust. She and I have been doing the show together for about a year. So you can find that it's a lot of geopolitical analysis, some domestic political analysis. You can find us on YouTube. Just search for Facts on the Ground. We should pop up. We're also on Rockfin. If you go to rockfin.com/FOTG, you can find our channel there. We upload our interviews to both Rockfin and YouTube, so whichever one you prefer. And then you can find me on Twitter at Jesse Zurawell, JESSE ZURAWELL. And yeah, everything that we have to say with Facts on the Ground and everything I have to contribute to the crazy Twitter psychobabble, you can find there.
All right, thanks again, Jesse. So yeah, to everybody, free Palestine, free Assange, free Mumia and all political prisoners, and stay informed.
Absolutely.